Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dick Morningstar, chairman of the Global Energy Center here. I think I know most of you. And I'm very pleased and we all are very pleased to welcome you here for a conversation about Bob Ichord's new report on the challenges and opportunities Indonesia faces in the energy sector. And Indonesia clearly is going to take on an increasingly important role in international energy markets and global efforts to address climate change. And this is the latest in Bob's series on transforming the power sector in developing countries, which he's working with us on and is extremely important. I might also say that our expert panel today we'll discuss the policy directions for advancing Indonesia's power transformation, regional and global aspects of creating sound energy policies, and also the importance of the relationship between the Trump administration and Indonesia. So again, it's a pleasure to welcome Bob, who's a non-resident senior fellow here. He's done a tremendous amount of work with us. He's also the CEO, I didn't realize this, of Ichord Ventures, LLC. Now, I know you're going bicycling in Vermont with your wife in a few weeks. Is that a venture? Or but Bob, as I know you all know, has had a distinguished 40-year career in the U.S. government, working on international energy security, development, and climate change issues, and has served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Transformation at the Bureau of Energy Resources at the U.S. Department of State, which hopefully that Bureau will continue unscathed, and obviously anybody who has any influence hopefully will help that. We also have on the panel Fei Yu, who is the Deputy Representative at the North American Office of the Asian Development Bank here in Washington. She's an economist specializing in development and environmental economics and has consulted with the World Bank, held positions with the United Nations. We have Tim Williamson, another veteran of federal service, is the CEO of Fed P3 LLC. I don't know, Ichord Ventures Fed P3 LLC, which works on emerging trends in public-private partnerships and third-party finance for repairs and alterations, capital asset improvements, infrastructure upgrades, energy efficiency improvements, and new renewable energy. And Tim spent 26 years in the federal government. A few of his prior roles include Deputy Director for Renewable Energy in the aforesaid Bureau of Energy Resources, and also U.S. Representative to the International Renewable Energy Agency. We also have Robert Fee, God, still another government person. He's now the Chief of Staff and Acting Senior Vice President for External Affairs at Cheniere. And before joining Cheniere, Robert was the Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor in the Office of Fossil Energy at DOE and was the liaison between business and advocacy communities on energy and environmental issues at both the White House Office of Public Engagement and the Department of Energy. And we're also pleased to welcome our moderator, last but not least, Ben Soloway, who's an assistant editor at Foreign Policy, and he previously worked in Indonesia as web editor and Princeton in Asia journalism fellow at the Jakarta Globe. So this conversation is actually on the record. You should know that. And it's being recorded for our website. And you can join the conversation on Twitter at AC Global Energy. And don't forget to hashtag #AC Energy. So with that, I think I've done everything I'm supposed to do. And I will turn it over to Ben, or Ben will moderate the panel, or Bob to first give us an overview of his paper.
I think we were hoping to start with Bob just giving us his introduction.
Thank you very much, Dick, and thank you for your support in this labor of love in this series on power sector transformation in developing countries, which is something that I have worked on for many years, as Charlie Ebinger and others in the room know. You know, after retiring from state, I really wanted to focus on the questions of power in developing countries and the implications in terms of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. You know, what were that's where the rubber meets the road in terms of can these countries make the political and economic decisions and choices to really implement these commitments that they have made, even though Paris, as we know, is a non-binding agreement. It is not a treaty or a legally binding commitment. And in that regards, obviously, the developing countries are so important to the future of the global energy system and to the emissions trajectories that we are seeing. IEA, of course, projects over 80% of future primary energy growth in the developing countries. Non-OECD consumption now is about 58% of total primary energy, so they surpassed the OECD countries a number of years ago, and OECD demand has been relatively flat. So really this growth in the developing countries is going to be fundamentally important in terms of deciding how our emissions trajectories develop. And of course in that, Asia's clearly a central and the most important region quantitatively, with India and China, of course, and the first report I did was on China and what's happening there in terms of their diversification strategies. Asia is, if you look at Asia as an overall, is twice as large in terms of its primary consumption as any other region in the world, and that will continue to grow. Indonesia, you know, of course, is often overlooked because of the huge importance of China and India. But Indonesia, you know, with 216 million people, growing at 5% a year, and with you know, electricity growth of 7-8%, is going to be very important to this future development of markets, and Asia in particular. So, you know, and Indonesia has moved from an oil exporter to become a major oil importer from 2004 to now. I did my dissertation in Indonesia in 1974. Indonesia was producing about 1.4 million, and consumption was, I don't know, several 100,000 barrels a day. Now they're producing 880 million barrels a day and importing 1.6 million barrels a day. So in that period of time, you've seen that tremendous change in the spurred by this domestic production. And we see similar trends in the gas sector, where gas has peaked. Consumption is rising at 4% or so a year. And the projections are that Indonesia will need to become looking at potential imports if they don't develop some of these large gas and expensive gas fields in the next, by 2020 or so, 2022. And we'll hear from Robert in terms of how Cheniere views that market. So a key proposition in all these studies is that countries face difficult political choices and obstacles to doing diversification. And Indonesia is no exception. And this report sort of stresses the importance of developing the policy, regulatory, and market institutional framework that can attract the investment that's necessary to make that diversification happen and to meet the growing needs. And so obviously the power sector is critical to that diversification from the standpoint of both economic growth and from the standpoint that you still have a large percentage of the population that don't have access to electricity. It's better than a lot of countries because it's like 94%, but you still have 20 or 30 million people without electricity. And that's an important factor in terms of government policies. The report calls for basic reforms in the power sector, which is, of course, dominated by the state company PLN. But the government has realized that in order to meet these growing demands, they need heavy private sector investment in IPPs. And so we'll talk more about that issue, but clearly that reliance on private investment is central. And can they, given the frameworks and without major changes in the regulatory framework, can they attract the investment that's necessary and attract the investment in the alternatives that the government has defined in its plans in terms of diversifying the economy, reducing coal's role by 2025 from 55% to 50%, increasing gas's role, and renewables. And so those are some of the issues that I talk about in the report. The government did make, and President Jokowi, you know, after he came in and we had the Paris Agreement, did make at least a commitment by 2030 to reduce emissions by 29%. So that's pretty, you know, people say, well, it's not too ambitious in terms of what they could achieve, but it's still going to be very difficult to achieve that if they're not able to attract the investment into the alternatives. So I think I will stop there, and just to say that I think that Indonesia, it's important to look at Indonesia in a regional context as well as in terms of its own national development. We worked, of course, a lot with ASEAN and the regional framework to try to promote interconnection and integration of regional markets. And then obviously from the standpoint of the emerging gas markets in the region, Indonesia, currently an exporter to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, China, is going to be that dimension of the development has critical regional implications for the future of the market in LNG and how that plays out with regards to both U.S. supplies as well as, of course, the growing supplies from Australia and other producers that are creating this situation where the prices are relatively favorable and certainly have dropped enormously since a few years ago when they were, you know, $17 per million BTUs in Asia. So lots of interesting issues. We have my colleagues, I thank them for willingness to participate in this process and to lend their expertise from, I think, different perspectives on the investment climate. So, Ben, thank you.
Okay, so thanks a lot. And thanks for having me here. I think the best way to start off would be just to have each panelist weigh in for a moment, and we can just go down the line. I hope, you know, during this conversation we'll be able to focus in turn on the investment climate, the international context, and challenges to moving away from coal in the energy mix and the role of gas and also renewables within that. Robert, do you want to start?
Thank you very much, and thank you to Ambassador Morningstar for the opportunity to be here, and Bob for your reports. And this is a really interesting framework. I'm sorry to have missed the last conversation, but I imagine that we'd be interested in participating in almost every one of your reports, looking at how do countries hit the Paris Agreement. You know, just from Shanir's perspective, a couple of months ago when the administration was kind of going through their very public debate over whether to stay in Paris, Cheniere kind of came out publicly in support of the Paris Agreement, not entirely for altruistic reasons. It's something that our company supports in terms of corporate social responsibility, but also for our business. We absolutely see that, and this is something that's been a market for, something that's happened because of market forces primarily of countries shifting from coal to gas, and the kind of environmental benefits on the climate side, but in a lot of countries, more importantly, on the air quality side that come from gas. The U.S. is one of the best examples of that because of the shale gas revolution. The drop in CO2 emissions because of coal to gas switching alone is something that I think a lot of countries should look to follow, although they have to kind of how they adjust that in their country with their own energy mix, and in Indonesia with renewables and the geothermal potential. So, Cheniere has 2 long-term sales and purchase agreements with Pertamina, which is Indonesia's state-owned energy company, for 1.5 million tons. They were actually our first and last customers at our Corpus Christi facility for trains 1 and 2. They signed the first deal in December of 2013, and the second deal in July of 2014. And so they're a major foundation customer for us for our facility in Corpus Christi that is expected to come online in 2019. Pertamina in Indonesia has been one of the largest exporters in the global LNG market for a long period of time. I think market watchers have seen them as they have continued to use their kind of domestic production has waned. They've continued to use they continue to export LNG, but they're using more LNG internal to the country. The geography of Indonesia alone makes LNG difficult, but also attractive proposition. Looking at kind of the LNG and then the regasifications facilities in Indonesia from east to west, you can kind of see that the domestic infrastructure constraints due to the kind of regionalized supply and demand issue is one of the major issues for LNG. And I think the idea of small-scale LNG, because you're kind of with the archipelago trying to bring LNG to multiple distribution centers, that's a challenge that is something similar to what's been talked about a lot in DC, which is small-scale LNG for the Caribbean. So that's something absolutely to watch. So I think, for us, for Cheniere, Indonesia is one of the countries to watch. We have a strong relationship with Pertamina. They are a sophisticated natural gas buyer. But a lot of kind of the future of Indonesia and kind of the Asian LNG market and the gas market globally will depend on policies. Market forces have increased the utilization of LNG as a fuel. Low prices right now have led a number of new countries to look towards LNG, and FSRUs, or floating storage and regasification units, have made it so that countries can start importing within 9-12 months, or as fast as 9 or 12 months. So we certainly see kind of increased usage of LNG. I think there's right now in the LNG space, the talk is of the quote-unquote supply glut, and absolutely there is a lot of incoming supply from the US and from Australia, but you're also seeing increased demand, and you're seeing with kind of just on prices, and let's just say in December 2016 and looking at prices for this winter, a lot of that LNG is getting taken up. So Indonesia is going to be a critical country to watch for our market.
Thanks a lot. And I think now we'll go to Faye.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here, and especially with the presence of Ambassador Morningstar. And I've reviewed Dr. Ichord's report, and I find that we really share a lot of your views in terms of ADB's sector assessment of Indonesia, and actually our forthcoming pipeline for the next 3 to 5 years very much follows some of the recommendations that you presented in your report. So the key for the key element of ADB's pipeline is this policy-based lending. So we're giving a more prominent role to policy-based lending in our pipeline because of the past lessons learned from implementing projects in Indonesia. So this has been an ongoing effort, the sector reform of in Indonesia. In the next 5 years, we are planning to approve up to $1.2 billion in terms of policy-based lending support for the Indonesian government. This is mostly in the form of budget support. The loan would be dispersed against objectives that are stipulated in the loan agreements, which mostly reflect the recommendations that Dr. Ichord's report outlined. So in terms of the focus of policy-based lending, we have three phases, and the policy support mostly include the in the first phase is more or less to create the enabling environment for businesses to invest in the region, and especially in terms of tariff reform and increasing or improving the performance of state-owned enterprises, the big state companies that are dominating Indonesia's energy market. And in the following phases of this policy-based loan would continue to deepen the reforms that are started in the first phase, with the objective also to promote private sector investment in the energy sector through streamlining the permitting, streamlining the processes that would make it easier for private sector to get involved. So one measure that was proposed or was discussed is a one-stop shop. So there's one place that you go to for all your investment needs. And in addition, this policy-based loan is going to be complemented by technical assistance projects that are designed to map out the steps in terms of undertaking reforms, and also to analyze the situation and obstacles and propose the way forward. In terms of private sector investment, ADB's private sector has been very active in getting involved in these investments. In particular, there's one project in Sumatra, the Geothermal project. This project. It's large scale, and ADB is one part of this financing consortium, which the total package is $1.2 billion in terms of loan financing. And this project will provide approximately 4 years of development phase for implementation, and the repayment is about 16 years. So the ADB's other initiatives in the next 3 to 5 years also include a pipeline of conventional projects that are focused on the geothermal and solar energy and energy efficiency. So there is a series of pilot projects that are proposed, and that will be piloted for renewable energy projects, including smaller scale solar projects. I can talk more about ADB's portfolio, but this is like a bit of a snapshot of what's happening in the next few years. So the way forward in terms of direction is the focus is on regulatory reform through providing budget support, and also to provide knowledge support. And this is being strengthened compared to the past because of the need because of the need to overcome a lot of the obstacles in terms of both implementing our own projects and the difficulty in attracting the private sector in investing in Indonesia.
Thanks a lot. So we've had a little bit of an introduction now to the fact that there are large-scale geothermal projects going on in Sumatra and pilot projects. I'm hoping that Tim will be able to give us a little bit of a deeper rundown on the challenges for geothermal. Indonesia has, I think, far and away more geothermal potential than any other country, but there are obstacles to tapping into it, and I think we'd be interested to hear about how to overcome them.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador Morningstar, Atlantic Council, and especially Bob for inviting me here. And thanks, Ben, for teeing this up. I think the keys for me for Indonesia are really kind of in three buckets. One is the transition from decentralized to centralized government from the IPP perspective, and trying to figure out how those local parties get their fair share. One of the things that was going on in the last 3 or 4 years was they pushed the decision-making down to the rural and the governor level. But what became very apparent to everyone was that you can't control the national goals when you have all of the local governments deciding the fate of the country. So it was pulled back to central control, but there's still this aggravation that is still sort of a rub, if you will, that there's really no way to get those local constituents to be empowered and really collectively support and engage in the projects without some sort of concession by MEMR or from the central government. So that's going to continue to be one of those transition things that the local and the central government is going to have to work out. The second thing I want to kind of talk about before I get to the geothermal is really the vacuous areas that exist in solar and efficiency. Right now, the price for solar is roughly in the mid-teens, 14, 15 cents. And if you were to somehow manage to make a panel manufacturing supply relevant in Indonesia, you could get a 25-cent feed-in tariff. But that's not supportable for the long haul, and everybody knows that. So what I want to tell you is that we're actively installing solar projects in this country at 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And it won't be too long before Indonesia has that same descent of cost in their price of power. So I think space to watch is solar, because it could have this incredible effect on how Indonesia moves forward. The second thing is if you've ever been to Indonesia, you discover that energy efficiency is not on the top of their list. It's not even on the list as far as I'm concerned. But it's clear that some sort of modicum of net zero energy buildings or some sort of transition towards a net zero building stock is going to have to take place in Indonesia. Otherwise, they're just going to be throwing air conditioning into the atmosphere before it's all over. So that's something I want to say. Now, back to the big kahuna for Indonesia, and that's geothermal. About 5 years ago, I spent a great deal of time trying to study and figure out how to unlock it in Indonesia. And thanks to Bob and good support from the Department of State, we were able to get out there and try to experiment with some of these things. And so what we did was we took the what really Ramon Guzman was doing in the IADB in Mexico and transplanted that program in sorts out to Indonesia and experimented with talking with PTSMI, the infrastructure group out there, with the Ministry of Energy and with the Ministry of Finance back in the day on how we might be able to implement something along those lines. And lo and behold, in the last 3 or 4 years, they've eventually come around. We have ADB now providing funds to a geothermal fund. We have the folks at SMAP at World Bank providing funds directly. There's a private fund that Pierre Audenet has within the SMAP envelope, which is a private public sector fund that has about $250 million in it. And PTSMI has taken the $50 million that they got from essentially the CIF program and added another $165 million towards it to get them a bulk of money that would enable them to start with these exploration and drilling projects. So right now they've done 13 projects. So 13 projects are done. 1.6 gigawatts of power is set to be installed. The 14th project will be installed sometime in the next 2 months. And there's another 1.6 gigawatts of power that's in line before 2020. And I think that they will successfully achieve 7,300, 7,500 megawatts of geothermal power by 2025. No problem, okay? Because I think we've got the ball rolling. What's less clear is how this all affects the local communities. Wellhead generators are just now starting to come into vogue. There's one that's been successfully launched, which is actually the 14th project that will come online this fall, which is essentially a direct exhaust geothermal turbine sitting right on top of a relatively shallow hole. It produces 20 megawatts and is designed for village power. So this is going to change the dynamic for some of these smaller islands. If they can physically install projects in a short amount of time, geothermal projects in a short amount of time, they can get quote-unquote baseload power, or at least 95% capacity factor power on the island. There's going to be little need for much else. And the other thing that's really interesting is the PLN is exploring these opportunities to have these merchant sort of operators out there in the field. So it's sort of direct competition with PLN in some of these smaller islands. So I think that will be a space to watch as well. Happy to get into other things as you go, man. That's my intro.
Great. I'm glad that we touched on those center-periphery issues. You know, the relationship between the federal government and states and local communities in Indonesia makes the problems we've had in the U.S. seem non-existent. And I'd be curious to hear the panelists weigh in on how it works when the very, there are existential questions toward pushing decision-making and power out to non-traditional power centers, and how the logistics work when you're dealing with a country with 17,000 islands, and the distance between, Aceh and West Papua is comparable to the distance between Alaska and Washington, D.C., crossing time zones. How do we get local communities into the mix, and what are the challenges for land use that seem to be holding up the development of geothermal projects? Maybe Tim can start us off in that direction.
For the one place where I think we've made, or the government of Indonesia has made great strides, is in the geothermal space. I can't say that the other renewable projects or even coal projects, other fossil projects are in the same category. But there's been a broad understanding that local constituents will reap benefits from these projects, both in terms of water, in terms of resources, and in terms of financial gain. So that's happening. So a negotiated settlement was just performed for a Supreme project in Aceh. It took them a month to negotiate the land settlement, but it was done, and everyone was settled on that. Now, I can't say the same is happening because there's really no central involvement with solar and hydro projects. Those other projects that are not being focused on are extremely difficult to get past the land use rights. So that still remains a big challenge.
think in looking at the center-periphery relationship, which is a long-standing issue in Indonesia, it's important to note that the islands, the outer islands, are really growing fast. I looked at the numbers. Sumatra's got electricity growth rate of 11%. East Indonesia, 10.9%. So there's tremendous economic activity that is, that is really creating these problems in terms of how to mobilize the investment in those outer islands in a way that's going to be able to sustain that. I mean, the other thing that we've talked about is the urbanization issues are becoming really critical, and actually the World Bank says that Indonesia's cities are growing faster than any other country, even in Asia. So, and Sumatra, some of the cities in Sumatra, reflect that. And so I think that this question of PLN and PLN's planning to meet the needs of these outer islands in the context of an effort to try, as Tim was saying, to allow some private investment into meeting those requirements, and how that plays out in the context of the local community and government leaders in terms of how they see these projects and the issues related to land and access to forest resources, which, as I point out, has been an important aspect because a lot of these lands are, and especially geothermal resources, are under the control of the forestry department. The government's tried to centralize that and make it easier to do the projects in those areas, but it's still been a process, a political process with the local communities. I mean, I think gas, the decentralized gas aspect that you mentioned, Robert, is going to be very important. And we know when we worked, of course, with General Electric, I don't know if anybody's here from General Electric, but on the small aeroderivative gas turbines. So, like the geothermal, 20, 25 megawatts, put up very quickly, and there was a big deal that was signed several years ago and reiterated when Vice President was in Indonesia recently. And we see more and more of those developing, too, to meet the supply. I think that, and that relates to this question of how is the infrastructure to supply the different islands going to develop? And we're seeing in the industry, I think, Robert, you agree, I mean, all kinds of efforts to try to develop LNG barging and other ways of supplying from floating plants power and to move that LNG around the country. So I think that it's going to be really interesting to see how these play out. I mean, the government has tried to allow more private ownership and operation of these small plants. So I think that's going to allow more decentralization with regards to the power sector and to try to meet this very rapid growth in these islands.
So in terms of issues related to the investment climate and incentive structures that are going to be necessary to deal with these issues, I wonder if the panelists can weigh in on basically what needs to change for the investment climate to be able to support more of the big infrastructure projects that are going to need to happen as Indonesia's energy demands continue to skyrocket and as they struggle to meet the Paris Accord and get the energy mix right. And the other thing I hope we can speak about is just how, the report calls for an independent regulator for the sector and all of these best practices that are absent a competitive sector, the relinquishing of PLN's monopoly. And those are tall orders, especially in Indonesia, where there are big bureaucratic hurdles toward getting there and where attempts have been made in the past that haven't come to fruition. And I'm just curious what the panelists see as intermediary steps or as first steps or as practical things that Jokowi might be able to do now or soon that could potentially move the country closer to some of the recommendations that Bob makes or that the ADB has made.
Thanks for the question. So ADB has recently introduced this lending to state-owned enterprises. This is a new measure. This is lending to state-owned enterprises with a government guarantee. In the past, we have been focusing more on sovereign loans, which is lending directly to the government. And now, because of the need for the state-owned enterprises to expand their electrification rate and meet the energy security demand, it is also important for them to get financial support. So in our design of policy-based lending, I'm just going to go through a few measures that are proposed to increase private sector participation. So one is the one-stop shop that I mentioned earlier, and the other one basically coordinating the approval procedures in one place, so the investors don't have to go to multiple agencies and get lots of stamps. And the other one is to reduce the approval time. So these are, we have, for the government to receive the loan disbursement, they have to meet the policy measures, the indicators that is specified in the loan project. So we made indicators that reflect how well the enabling environment is for the private sector, including approval times. And in addition, it is important to allow private sector to access PLN's transmission lines. And this was in the 2009 electricity law, but implementation was not enacted until early 2015. So this is another measure that we're pushing for from the ADB side. The government has now established the basis for wheeling arrangements that could allow private power producers to use PLN's transmission system to sell power directly to end users in distant locations. So the other aspect that addresses the central-local kind of relations is also that we are pushing for for implementation of the geothermal law, including tendering of concessions and revenue sharing with local governments. This does not go down to the community level, but at least it's a central-local level. There is this fiscal arrangement that would guarantee that the local level also benefit from this geothermal development. So these are a few measures that in addition, we also, as I mentioned earlier, we are piloting some small and medium scale power projects. So these are also considered to be suited to the decentralized nature of power supply in Indonesia. One of those is a gas-solar hybrid. So we're trying to introduce some more innovative ways to supply power in the region.
Sure. Yeah, I think Faye's really touched on something very important. I think the certainty